Hey, welcome to Film Fanatics, 3 film geeks discussing movies new and old. My name is Dan.
My name is Justin.
And I'm Joe.
This week, one of the greatest movie monsters of all time rears its head yet again with Godzilla. John Hamm attempts to win the hearts of baseball fans with Million Dollar Arm, and Dorothy returns to Oz in a new animated film. In honor of Godzilla, our top 5 this week is franchise reboots, and our triple feature of older movies is Savages, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and for our Oscar A to Z, All the President's Men. Before we start, though, Justin touched on something that annoys him in last week's review for Mom's Night Out, that it had a misleading trailer hiding its religious agenda. I would counter that this week's Godzilla has a similar misdirect in having the only voice in the entire preview, that of Bryan Cranston, who is, of course, hugely popular right now, yet he's only in about 4 scenes of the film. And Joe was even annoyed with the Neighbors trailer, showcasing jokes that didn't end up in the movie. So I just wanted to kind of pick your brains about this. I don't know if there's a question I want to ask, but there's obviously a discussion to be had about this.
Well, I'll just start off by saying, now, obviously, trailers are supposed to get you psyched for the movie, and they're supposed to pick the certain scenes that, in a correlation, that'll get you excited for it, get you thinking about it, talking about it. Obviously, they're going to try and mislead you to get you excited about it no matter what. But normally, the trailers at least have scenes that are in the movie, so they're not giving you false information. Okay, so you can actually, to some degree, hopefully, be excited for what you're seeing. Now, there have been cases where sometimes trailers will, they will use a scene that they decide to cut out right at the last minute. It has happened before. Mm-hmm. But lately, it seems like every big movie this year is doing this, and it's really blatant. It's not one scene, it's multiple scenes.
And you mentioned it about Amazing Spider-Man 2 as well.
Amazing Spider-Man 2, there's one scene where Harry Osborn's telling Peter, he's like, Oscorp had you under surveillance, which is really crucial to one of the main plots of the movie, completely not in the movie. It's just really annoying. So yeah, it's been really kind of bugging me. I noticed with Neighbors, you guys said with Mom's Night Out, with Godzilla, I thought it was misleading as well, in a big way, kind of.
Yeah.
Not just with Bryan Cranston, but for.
I'll
go into my review, but basically with Godzilla, even I felt like it was not advertised as the movie was.
My thing with the comedy trailer specifically, I'm kind of more okay with them putting a joke in the trailer that isn't in the movie, as long as the scene is in the movie, because that's sort of what happened with Neighbors, because I feel like sometimes, because the trailers have to be, 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes, whatever, they need to get to the punchline sometimes quicker, so I feel like maybe they'll take a different take that isn't in the movie, like a different line read, especially with these Seth Rogen type movies that are sort of improv partially. A similar thing was done, I guess it was 2 summers ago, with the movie The Watch, with Ben Stiller and Vince Vaughn. There were a lot of jokes in the trailer that those scenes weren't even in the movie. So I thought it was a little more negotiable with Neighbors, but I totally can see, why it's frustrating.
I mean, I can understand a hook that's kind of just there to get you in, but I think if it's multiple scenes, like if you have a funny joke, you can keep it in the movie. I wouldn't have gotten bored seeing Seth Rogen fly a certain way again.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I just thought it was a bit misleading. It just bugged me. It just really bugged me.
How does it affect... I mean, obviously, we'll talk about Godzilla in a second, but how do you think it affects you mentally? Like, once you see the movie, and you're like, well... I mean, it doesn't affect your grade of the movie, probably, but it's an annoyance, or does it affect your grade?
I try not to let it affect the grade too much. Obviously, I want to, judge the film for what it is. But I still think you kind of have to take that into account a little bit, because if it is being marketed as one thing and then it turns out to be another, I think even Justin had a problem with that with Mom's Night Out.
He definitely did.
I think that
he said that his grade would be higher.
I mean, that's a whole discussion, taking into account the trailers as being part of the film process itself, but I like trailers. I think trailers are kind of an art in and of themselves, and I think they are important.
And I completely agree.
So I think if you're going to say one thing and you're going to market a film a certain way, at least use the scenes that you want to use that you think will be the strongest to sell the film. Don't blatantly cut these things out. I just think that's a little unfair, because people will be expecting a certain type of movie using these scenes as a basis. And if they don't get that, they're getting a different movie.
Well, and I think what's sad about it is it's 2 separate entities really involved, because you have the director and the editor and the production staff and all of that working on the movie, and then each studio has an entirely separate marketing team that has, I would assume, little contact with the people involved in making the movie.
They're probably just saying,
You know?
hey, we have, even sometimes while the film's in development, we've got these scenes. We know generally what this is about. These are the fans that we're trying to sell it to. This is the audience. Let's just try and spin this how we can. Maybe without even knowing what the movie's completely about.
Yeah.
So, yeah, maybe.
And that can happen too, I guess, because sometimes, right, with these early previews, like you say, they're still in production as we get maybe the first teaser trailer or even sometimes the first full trailer.
They might just use,
so things do get cut out of the movie once it's in editing.
Yeah, that does happen sometimes in the first trailer. You might have that first scene, maybe in the film's still being filmed. They might actually have a couple of concrete pieces that are being edited together, and it might not even be there. Are they at all?
We talked about this slightly last year with Wolf of Wall Street. Because from the trailer, it looked like Matthew McConaughey was going to be a fairly large part of this movie, and he's in literally the first 15 minutes.
To be fair, that's a little different, but it is related because they used the scenes that he was in.
They did. That is true.
But with the time of the trailer and the way they focused on it and using his name as saying he was starring in it, did imply that he was a bigger part.
Right.
So that was smart marketing, but yes, very misleading too. And because Matthew McConaughey has been getting more popular lately, and people knew that was going to be another big hook. Of course, Scorsese, Leo, but Matthew McConaughey has been big the last couple of years. So, Justin, you're very quiet. Speak.
Well, the thing we have to take into consideration is these people are trying to make people see the movie. With Godzilla, we all know Bryan Cranston was the crux of the trailer, but we have to remember at the exact same time, people know who Bryan Cranston is. Breaking Bad just ended. It was a huge fan base. It was a huge following. Aaron Taylor Johnson, who plays the lead in the movie, people know him from Kick-Ass, but not much else. I mean, obviously, we're going to talk about Savages later, but he's not exactly a household name or anything. You don't sound sold on that.
Well, I guess, no, he's definitely not a household name. The part I'm not sold on is, okay, fine, Bryan Cranston's in the movie, but it's a Godzilla movie. I don't think you need any actor to sell it.
We're going to be talking about this.
I was going to say
I'll talk about it.
Okay.
Because I know where you're coming from, Dan. Godzilla should stand on his own. We'll go into this.
But what we'll see with a lot of movies is, and you both touched on this, is the fact that the marketing team is often separated from the distributor.
Yep.
And they probably have hours and hours and hours of footage, and they don't know what the distributors have said this is going to be in the movie, not necessarily a deleted scene or whatnot. So they're just trying to figure out how can we make people want to see this movie. That's why we have seen over the past 3 to 5 years great trailers for terrible, terrible movies.
Runner.
The Devil Inside. And we've also seen really horrible, horrible trailers for great movies like End of Watch.
Yeah.
I didn't think the trailer to Silver Linings Playbook was that good.
Oh my gosh, the trailer for Silver Linings.
I think if that didn't get nominated for all these awards, it wouldn't have done anything. Because the trailer didn't make it look appealing.
I completely agree. If it had not been for that, or the fact that Jennifer Lawrence was in it, I would have completely skipped that movie.
I think that that just goes to show how important the trailer really is.
Yeah,
and the whole marketing behind the movie.
Yeah,
it's true.
Well, love it or hate it, the trailer for Godzilla obviously worked. It opened to $93 million this weekend, which is thus far in 2014 the second highest opening weekend after Captain America. So let's talk about Godzilla now, and that's going to be with Joe.
All right. Got to start this off by saying, Gojira! Anyway, Godzilla is the second American version of the story of the titular monster. It is directed by the relatively new director Gareth Edwards, who previously did Monsters, and it stars Aaron Taylor Johnson, Ken Watanabe, Elizabeth Olsen, and Bryan Cranston. After Joe Brody, a.k.a. Bryan Cranston's wife, is killed by a mysterious explosion at a nuclear reactor in Japan, Joe spends the next 15 years obsessed with trying to figure out why. His trespassing on the site of the explosion forced his son, Ford, played by Johnson, to come help him find out what happened. Their investigation soon leads to a discovery of a prehistoric creature which may threaten the planet. Mankind is not alone, though, as another ancient creature, Godzilla, has risen from his ancient hibernation to do battle with the monster and save mankind. This movie is very tricky to talk about. I'll start off by discussing what I liked. I will say that the scenes with the monster battles, which is what the hardcore fans want to see, are awesome when they are done. Godzilla himself looks great and has some really cool scenes, and they are definitely worth the wait. I also felt that Cranston brought true humanity to Joe Ford with his fantastic performance, but it's Bryan Cranston, so I would expect nothing less. He was easily the most interesting character in the movie, at least human character. Sadly, when Cranston leaves the film, it becomes a very different kind of movie. Ford, unfortunately, like just about every other character in the film, is rather flat and underdeveloped. This is unfortunate since he is the center of the film for the most part. He's not bad, just not interesting enough in my opinion to carry the rest of the movie. I don't mind adding humanity to balance out the monster battles, and I think Justin would say that some of the best Godzilla movies had this, primarily the original. However, while some Toho movies do find this balance, some do not. But usually they offer fun monster fights with our favorite lizard. This is where the biggest issue for me comes with this one. The human elements worked as well for about the time that Cranston was on screen. After that, I really just wanted to see some monster fights. I understand holding out to build some tension, and when Godzilla shows up, it is truly great. It's after we see the big guy, though, that things kind of fall apart. The fights are awesome, but we barely see them until maybe about the last 10 minutes of the movie that you get the full brunt of it. So to sum it up, I like that an attempt of a balance was there, and this was the making of a truly great film. However, it doesn't quite make it there. And as a Godzilla comeback, I'd say it's a kind of a mixed bag. What fans get is awesome, but there's just not quite enough of it for me, and I give it a B.
All right. And before we go to Justin, I do want to point out that you guys have been doing these There Goes Tokyo podcasts on Joe's channel, sort of ramping up to the premiere of this, watching, was it 26?
28.
28 of the the former Godzilla movies, all of them really. Mm-hmm. And so if you have not listened to that yet and you're interested, you can link to that in the description of this podcast. So Justin, let's hear from you about Godzilla 2014.
There are two components that make up a great Godzilla film: the human side, and, as to be expected, that of the titular monster, and whatever other creature the film has set him up with. Balancing both has never been easy for the franchise, and as such, only 3 or 4 of the original films have really handled it well. In the reboot, this balance is a bit of a mixed bag, as Joe has mentioned. While Cranston's performance, I completely agree with Joe, adds great humanity to the story, giving some of the best 15 minutes to a movie I've seen in a very long time, his limited screen time ultimately relies on leading man Taylor Johnson, who, much like with many of his other films, really seems to struggle with holding his own for about the first act and a half. However, where Godzilla truly shines is when these two components collide in a gloriously chaotic climax. This leads to a somewhat rushed ending, but if this is how Godzilla has begun as a new franchise, the future is very bright, and I give it a B+.
All right, well, I am definitely the Godzilla rookie on the show. You guys, a few months ago, showed me 2 of the older movies, including the English version of the very original film. And I avoided the 1998 remake at all costs on just about everyone's recommendation.
Which is good.
Though it does have a great soundtrack.
It does. Puff Daddy.
We all know that. So while I have little to compare this version of Godzilla to, it seems that we're all kind of on the same page anyway. As an action movie, it mostly works, being held together with a strong, if a little confusing storyline and lots of destruction. But what I didn't understand is why Godzilla himself seemed like a supporting character in his own movie. I mean, Joe, right?
I have to confess, I kind of felt that way.
Yeah.
And...
I mean, he actually received, I thought, less screen time than the Mutos, even.
The monsters, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, once he shows up, it's all hands on deck as we prepare for fun and mayhem. The mayhem ensues. The fun, however, is questionable. The movie seems to take itself a bit too seriously, and like you guys both mentioned, Aaron Taylor Johnson in the leading role, I mean, he could have been anybody, for one thing. His character's story with the father was good, Bryan Cranston, but just getting started when Cranston exits the film.
Honestly, I felt like they just segued him in there. Like, they try to make him out like he's this big action star. He's really important, but he's even goes at one scene and says, "Hey, can I join up with you guys? I'm an explosives expert." And it's just like, well, anybody could have been in that.
Yeah. Exactly.
He's kind of a generic nobody.
And I didn't care about the Elizabeth Olsen, his wife whole thing. That was...
Not enough time spent on it.
Not enough time spent on it. And it just... I felt like, A, it could have been played by anybody. And B, there was no... It was almost an unnecessary character to the whole story.
Well, they were trying to give him some humanity by giving him something to care about to get back to, but like I said...
Which I would argue worked to some extent. I do agree with you. I wish there had been more of it.
Should have been more of it, definitely.
But in a way, much of your criticism of it, I think is a lot of what made the original film a classic. Is the fact that, yes, Godzilla may seem like a supporting character, but that's because they want to emphasize the human component to the story. It's not just his movie.
But it's not done very well.
I'm not arguing that. I'm just saying that it's more than just a simple monster movie.
No, I mean, I'm there
Listen.
with you. I'm there with you.
If they had developed the relationship between Johnson and Cranston more, I would have been fine with that because I liked where that was going.
I agree.
That's
You know?
the center of the movie.
Right. But then when that stops, I just didn't care about any of the other people. But the fight sequences, as you guys both mentioned, in the last third of the film really hold it together. The visuals are also great. So overall, Godzilla gets a B from me, much like Joe. And if this is to be the start of the new franchise, which I assume with the box office take this weekend it will be, I'm more than okay with that.
That's cool. I have something I'd like to add, though. You were kind of right. I do feel like in some ways Godzilla was kind of a side character. Not just because of the human factors, but because there's kind of another threat. And it kind of felt like that was like a different script, and in some ways they kind of shoved Godzilla in there. That's fine. And I think that this kind of goes to the way we were speaking about the trailers were advertising it. The way it was going, I think it was trying to advertise that Godzilla was the threat. It was kind of like his comeback. He was basically the villain. Now, what was kind of a surprise to me, which I actually kind of liked because it's kind of how Godzilla is traditionally known, Godzilla really is the hero. Kind of like the Japanese spiritualist dragon that he's kind of come to be known as, sort of a superhero, and it's like that's kind of accepted in the film. They even say force of nature, kind of protector of mankind. Even nicer than he usually is. It was pointed out by some people that I was discussing this, that even sometimes some of the people that he was working with were trying to shoot him, they were planning to kill him, and he wasn't even retaliating at all.
Right.
Like, this is the most good I think I've seen Godzilla ever. Really. You know, and I mean,
It's up there.
Maybe not fluffy, but in terms of like not trying to cause destruction intentionally, he's pretty nice. So it was kind of cool to actually see him in this heroic position, but I don't think that's what anybody was expecting. I think that was not how it was advertised at all. And I was curious to see what you guys felt about that, because I kind of liked it, but I will admit it really did catch me off guard, because I don't think that's what anybody thought was the point of the movie.
Well, most people that think of Godzilla nowadays think of the latter half of the 28 Godzilla movies that have been made. Godzilla fights things, it's all about that, and little else. There is some degree of a human story, but we've seen in so many movies, it's weak or completely ridiculous.
Cheesy or weak. 9 times out of 10.
Or some variation between the two.
And the original film was probably one of the few exceptions.
Exactly. With this, I think they're trying to handle the best of both, because we have seen some of the movies where he has faced off against other monsters, and there has been a great human component to it.
It's true. There have been some good ones.
But
I just feel like it was lacking there and here.
Oh, no, I'm not denying that it had setbacks. I mean, there's a reason I can't in good conscience give it an A- or an A. But I feel like he was trying to appeal to both, trying to still handle the...
No.
I don't really think Godzilla so much as a hero as much as an anti-hero. Yes, he is trying to stop Muto, but at the same time, he's also this very, very destructive force himself.
He is, but it's like I said, I think he's generally considered to be more of a heroic figure than not. At least...
Well, I mean, take the scene where they're on the bridge. Godzilla goes under the bridge
He tries to avoid...
try and not hurt anybody.
That's what I'm saying. He really was trying to go out of his way not
Right.
to. He actually looks at a human character and is like, he doesn't like... He's not that evil in this. He just isn't.
No.
Which I was fine with, but I just wasn't expecting.
It was not
what do you think?
What was marketed, that's
you know
for
what I'm saying?
sure.
Like, I thought it was like
Absolutely.
Godzilla, force of destruction,
I didn't
evil.
even think there was any other monsters in it.
Well-
I mean, I know that that's a typical... Godzilla trope, but I thought, well, it's the first one, maybe it's just Godzilla.
If you were hinting at the trailer, they did show a couple, like one monster flying and like an insect leg, so people knew that there was something there.
There was a little illusion, but I mean, I can easily understand where you can see it as a
Right.
as a standalone Godzilla movie.
And
Right.
honestly, I thought, like from what I said, the way it was marketed, I felt like this was going to be Godzilla, evil, comeback. That's what this is about. This is like going back to Gojira, which it wasn't. I mean, it's going for the more traditional Godzilla movie with a more serious American take.
But let me ask you something, Joe.
Okay.
If they did the original 1954 Gojira, which was a very dark but very human story, would it have sold? Because I feel like there are components of it that would have been really good, and I would have loved to see him in this movie. But I don't feel like a straight up interpretation of that would have made that much money. I feel like it would have been a little bit too deep for mainstream audiences. So I kind of like that I really like the director actually took his own spin on this.
Well, in response to that, I would say I think that I understand where you're coming from. I think it would have done better critically if they'd focused a little more on the story and made it darker. But I think that adhering to the marketing with Godzilla being the hero and fighting other monsters is technically something that would sell better. But I don't think it was really done quite that well enough to, adhere to that. So I don't really know. I feel like they were trying to find that balance. Personally, I feel like the fact that they were remaking Godzilla again anyway, it would have sold no matter what. It was Godzilla.
I do too. I mean, obviously the trailer, as we talked about, didn't really show that much,
and people were still like,
is almost $100 million opening weekend.
So I guess my answer would be, I think that the fact that they were putting effort into a Godzilla movie again would have been enough.
Mm-hmm.
People would have been like, I gotta check this out.
Sure enough.
Gotta redo the Matthew Broderick.
Thank goodness that wasn't there.
Yeah, I'm glad I avoided that, and now I don't really ever have to see it.
You've seen a better movie.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what I hear. And, thank goodness for that. All right, well, up next is $1 Million Arm, and Justin's going to tell us about that.
Davey Bernstein, played by John Hamm, is a sports agent desperate to sign an athlete when he discovers while watching cricket that he may be able to teach one of the players how to be a baseball pitcher over the course of a year. He puts together a reality show called, as the title suggests, $1 Million Arm, where the two finalists, Rinku Singh, played by Suraj Sharma, and Dinesh Patel, played by Madhur Mittal, are given a trip to America where they can try out for an MLB team. Cross-culture clash movies are largely hit or miss, but rarely are they right down the middle as evident in $1 Million Arm. However, instead of looking at both cultures with respect and admiration, Million takes the ever-cliche motif of America as the land of opportunity and reducing India to being the butt of a variety of bland jokes, several of which could be easily argued as racist. As his neighbor, played by Lake Bell, quite literally does at one point. Mm-hmm. However, for being a feel-good baseball movie, the film definitely does have charm. Sharma and Mittal are fun to watch despite their fish-out-of-water antics occasionally stretching the boundaries of believability, and the ending is mostly, keyword being mostly, satisfying. $1 Million Arm isn't bad for summer family entertainment amidst action blockbusters and raunchy comedies, but that's really about it, and I give it a C.
Well, I will say this, much like the young Indian men's pitching in the beginning of the film, $1 Million Arm is kind of all over the place. For one thing, and again with the previews, since the previews gave away who wins the $1 Million Arm contest, the first 45 minutes or so of the movie are relatively useless and lack any kind of suspense. Once the story moves to America, it becomes more engaging, but still not really at all surprising. Partially, again, due to the trailer, but partially because every turn it has is obvious. The acting is strong, featuring alums from Slumdog Millionaire, Life of Pi, and the one-time highest-grossing Bollywood film of all time, Three Idiots. Also, Bill Paxton has a particularly strong performance as Tom House, the pitching coach charged with getting the boys in shape for their big league showcase. Parents should be aware that even though the film is rated PG, young children will likely be bored with it, and some of it is in Hindi and subtitled, so they may be lost with some of the backstory. It's a very by-the-numbers film, but the acting and well-hit emotions are enough to raise it to the slightly positive category, and it gets a B- out of me. Joe?
Well, I will admit I kind of suspected there was going to be kind of that fine line where it's like we're trying to pay homage to a culture, but it does kind of border into the racist category.
I didn't get really the racism.
Okay, there was a scene where literally
Bill dresses up?
No, that wasn't that big of a deal to me. When John Hamm goes over to try to look for the players over at Indian, and the one guy helps him out, he's like, well, you see, Indians like to honk, and we like to cheat the system. That's the way all Indians are. It's like saying all Americans like to eat hamburgers. Like it's
all right.
It's a little bit.
I guess maybe when they're in India. Once they get back to America, though, I mean, I think it makes sense that these boys wouldn't know what an elevator was.
That wasn't cheap.
That stuff wasn't racist.
I thought those were cheap laughs. Actually, I want to ask you, how did you guys feel about the their coach, the guy that basically joins it for free to work?
Oh, yeah,
that character,
the baseball fan.
The baseball hardcore fanboy. Because I felt like I liked his character arc, but at the same time, I felt that he was...
Caricature?
Yeah, he was a complete caricature. I thought he was like slapstick.
Yeah, he kind of was. Listen, the humor didn't work in this movie.
The comedy did not work.
The comedy was gentle at best.
Well, I think if I had to sum up $1 Million Arm, I would say that ultimately it's a pretty by-the-numbers sports, fish-out-of-water story. But, I mean, in terms of kind of hitting the feel-good emotions, I'm kind of with Dan. I mean, like, you've got some great actors. You've got John Hamm.
Yep. He did a fine job.
You know, and I thought that the Indian gentlemen, they did well as well. I thought they were convincing.
Mm-hmm.
I liked their stories. I thought that, it's based on a true story. I thought it was kind of inspirational. It wasn't quite the predictable story I thought it was going to be. There were some angles they went and explored I didn't expect. And I thought the love story was a bit weak.
Really?
I kind of did, but I don't know. Then at the end, when they say like what really happened,
got married,
they really did get married. So, I imagine it's pretty true to life.
I guess it is. I don't know. I thought that it could have been handled a little better, at least towards the beginning. I thought it was a bit awkward, but I don't know. Maybe that's how it happened. I guess awkward things have happened. Overall, though, I don't know. It was pretty decent. Like I said, I think it's held up by the performances. I think the right emotions are hit. I think the core of the story is good. There was some suspense. And I actually would kind of fit in the B- as well. I did enjoy it.
Okay. I kind of did too.
I can't say I didn't enjoy it. I'd probably watch it again.
Yeah, I would watch it again. I mean, it was very Jerry Maguire-y, just in the...
It's actually funny. I was thinking Jerry Maguire goes to Bollywood.
Kind of, basically. Yeah.
Which is probably my 5-word review. Because it's kind of what it was.
That would make sense, yeah.
Because, he goes off on his own. I'm like, this is picking up where Jerry Maguire left off.
Right.
He said he goes to India because he couldn't find a Cuba Gooding
Yeah,
Jr.
I mean, basically, if it wasn't a true story, I would definitely be crying like plagiarism. I mean, it's
maybe it's a common thing that happens.
Yeah, I mean, I assume it is, and obviously, this agent that John Hamm plays had no money, no prospects. He needed to find something to start over his business, basically. Mm-hmm. I guess that's what really happened. So it's hard to say
how it played out.
I thought it hit the right emotional.
You know how it is
tones.
when they're adapting something that's true. They'll take liberties.
Well, that is true. I'm sure there's some
Disney.
liberties.
Yeah, it is Disney, so they'll push certain angles to make it more, applicable.
More heartfelt.
For the kids. Yeah.
For the kids. Yeah, which again, I don't think this movie is really for.
I think it's kind of an...
I mean, if it's for kids, it's like for 10 and up.
Yeah,
basically.
It's a family movie-ish.
I was going to say, there's nothing like I'd have problems taking a kid to in it. I mean, yes, there's...
Yeah, no, I just don't think they would appreciate it. Yeah, it's not really made for kids.
Most kids, probably would not be that interested.
Up next, we have Legends of Oz, Dorothy's Return. This is an animated film that takes place years after Dorothy, voiced here by Lea Michele, was last in Oz. Years have only gone by in Oz, though. Back in Kansas, it's only been a day. The timeline is one of the many things about this movie that make no sense, but I digress. Her old friends the Scarecrow, Tin Man, and Lion, voiced by Dan Aykroyd, Kelsey Grammer, and Jim Belushi, respectively, need her help to fight off the Jester, played by Martin Short, who is getting his revenge on Oz and its leaders because he's the brother of the deceased Wicked Witch of the West. Meanwhile, in Kansas, a shady government appraiser, also of course voiced by Short, is trying to buy up all the destroyed land after the tornado. You guys know the phony look-alike movies that you see at Walmart to fool people into thinking they're the real thing. Kiara the Brave, Night of the Magic Museum.
You see them on Netflix sometimes.
The quote-unquote real Puss in Boots.
It's like the, what would you call that?
I call them fake movies.
Like
pretty much.
What's that studio that does all like the rip-offs, like Transmorphers?
Yeah. There's live-action ones they do too.
It's kind of like that, but for that company that just
basically,
yeah.
And Legends of Oz is basically that in every single way, except that it got a theatrical release. Attempting to capitalize on a summer with few animated releases, upstart company Clarius Entertainment was somehow able to attract some actual name performers to this terrible project. The animation is crude, the voice actors don't even try and ape their 1939 counterparts that the kids are familiar with, the new characters introduced, with the exception of the Jester, are uninspired, and the songs, with the possible exception of one, are complete throwaways. The only thing almost clever is that the marshmallow military man that Dorothy meets has Twizzlers for tassels on his uniform. If you like that, maybe you'll find something more appealing than I did. For me, Legends of Oz is an easy F. Joe?
Well,
what a train wreck.
I kind of wish that I really hadn't seen it.
Join the club there, buddy.
I don't know. Okay, one thing that really confused me, and maybe, I don't know if either you could clarify this, but the timeline. You mentioned the timeline.
Yes.
which I still didn't get.
Makes no sense.
Okay,
At all.
but it's not the timeline. It's the setting. That traditionally, Wizard of Oz, if we're at least basing it off the original film, took place in the 30s.
Right.
But this one takes place in modern times.
Correct. That's one issue.
With no explanation at all. Like I didn't think.
Correct.
It's unnecessary. Like
it's very unnecessary. And the other timeline issue I had was, okay, fine. They explain that, well, it's been years since she was here, but to her it's just been a day.
But
okay,
then
that's fine.
She goes back though.
But then she goes back.
Oh, where you been?
And then right. She was only there for about, in Oz time, like a day and a half maybe. So that would be maybe 3 seconds to the real world.
Yeah, that was one thing that kind of bothered me. I didn't understand that choice. I didn't think the animation was as terrible as you did. I thought it was okay. Like, I didn't think it... I've seen worse. Like, personally, I thought that Freebirds and what's the one we all argued about? The Nut Job. I think that had uglier animation for me, personally.
I thought it was about on par.
I thought it was a little worse. I liked some of the interpretations of the characters they were going for. I'm not sure if it worked. Like, the Scarecrow... He had a brain, so they tried to make him a genius, like a tactical genius. And,
yeah.
Like, I thought it was a cool idea, but his plans were dumb.
Well, they did that Sherlock Holmes stuff with him.
Yeah, where
like he sees the different...
I thought I kind of liked that.
Trigonometry
I'm not going to
stuff.
lie. I liked the fact that the Tin Man was a wreck. I thought that was an interesting play. The Lion was completely, like...
Useless
character.
Jim Belushi.
Yeah. But I did like the fact that there was some good voice talent. I can't say I didn't like the Jester.
He was the only thing that almost saved it.
I thought the villain was actually okay. I thought he was pathetic towards the end, though, because he did get kind of... Spoilers, he gets kind of overthrown by one of his own people. But
yeah.
It was really lame. But I still thought he was kind of entertaining, even though he had no motivation.
Well, and at one point... Yeah, he has no motivation. And at one point, Dorothy literally throws a sheet on him, or like a curtain.
And he can't get out.
He loses all of his power, and he can't get out.
And he's like spending... That's actually a good point. He spends his time trying to get out of this cloak, but... It's a blanket. You can just like lift
literally
it.
Just lift
but he's
it
like,
up.
I can't get out. I mean, like, but you can just lift it up. I don't know.
But he had a harder time getting out of it than my cat when he's under a blanket.
Yeah,
I did. You just walk out of it, Jester.
I don't know. By the way,
what are you doing?
Yeah, what are you doing?
But I will confess, I think the one thing that'll kind of save it for me is that I actually did like the newer side characters. I liked Wiser the Owl. I thought he wasn't bad.
I hated Wiser the Owl.
I liked Wiser.
Couldn't stand him.
Yeah, couldn't stand him.
I liked the Marshmallow guy.
He was all right.
I liked the Marshmallow. What was it? Marshall Mellow?
Marshall Mallow.
I kind of liked that. I didn't like the princess though.
She was awful.
I didn't understand why Marshall Mellow would go for her, because she was a terrible person. Like that whole why he felt. I didn't get that.
His love song to her, by the way, is the only one that I'm like kind of okay with.
Actually, I thought the music was all right.
I
mean, it wasn't great. I'm not gonna say it was great, but I was one of the few things that surprised me. I thought it was okay. Overall, what about Tug? Was that Patrick Stewart? It sounded like Patrick Stewart.
It was Patrick Stewart.
Tug was all right.
Though going back to the porcelain princess thing, the wooing scene I thought was completely disturbing.
Yeah, it was weird.
Yeah, she basically kills a bunch of her subjects.
Murdered everyone. Yeah.
But I don't know. I thought it was bad, but there were things about it that kept me relatively interested up until like the last 20 minutes.
Okay.
So for me, it would get a D. Because, I don't know, I didn't hate it completely. Just like, by the last 20 minutes, I wanted to leave. But I was like, this wasn't quite as bad.
First hour was okay.
First hour was fine for me. I was like, it's generic and it's mediocre, but I didn't think it was like the worst thing ever.
Okay. Justin, what did you think?
There's no way to sugarcoat this one, listeners. This one's bad. Granted, even Oz the Great and Powerful had its critics and criticisms as well, but at least that had a coherent narrative and better funding, as it seems the distributors only hired a small football team of people to produce this garbage. However, aside from the lazy narrative, the biggest offense this movie offers up is the performances. Provided the amount of talent in this movie, with the exception of the ever-awful Lea Michele, one would expect better acting, but instead, and this is partially due to the completely incomprehensible script, almost all of them phone it in, making the just slightly over 90-minute movie feel clumsy and awkward. That said, once the cringe-inducing, wildly forgettable song numbers get introduced, it almost makes one hope for the return of the flimsy story. In actuality, I could go on and on about the glaring flaws about this film, from the stiff animation that almost feels like stop motion, to so many other things I don't feel like mentioning, but I feel like that would be devoting more time to this film than it ever deserved. And alongside Dan, I also give this one an F.
Oh, no, I want to spend more time on it. Okay, one other thing. So, Justin, I don't know if you noticed this, because you're the one who mentioned this to me before we saw it, about how it's based on a book by, what is he, the brother of L. Frank Baum?
Grandson.
The grandson. Okay. Did you notice in the opening credits that they, it was like all tornado based?
Yep.
And so things would fly in and stuff. And they would hold on a person's name for, a few seconds or whatever. The title card that said, based on the book, whatever, Dorothy's Return by Roger Stanton Baum, lasted for like a half a second. It was like there, and then the tornado took it right away.
Wow.
So obviously they were trying to, avoid the knowledge of that.
Interesting fact, though. After we did watch the movie, I looked up a plot synopsis of the actual book. Mm-hmm. It is relatively coherent in contrast to this piece of...
Well, I would hope so.
Garbage is a very accurate statement. The jester actually has some degree of a motive. The jester is actually possessed by the spirit of the Wicked Witch of the West.
Oh, that I like.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting.
Which is why that was a big deal, but obviously they decided to do that for the movie.
All right. Well, now we can stop with that. All right, up next is Dom Hemingway, and Justin's got that.
Meet Dom Hemingway, played by Jude Law. A notorious safecracker just coming out of prison after 12 years for refusing to rat out any of his friends, and bent on getting back what he feels is owed. However, when his money is once again stolen from him, Dom begins his search to get it back while trying to reconnect with his daughter, played by Game of Thrones' Emilia Clarke, who hates him. The twisted brilliance of cinema nowadays is having a protagonist that tests the limits of what an audience is willing to enjoy. Is it manipulative? Perhaps. But with a hilariously egocentric performance like the one Law gives in Dom Hemingway, it's worth it. Law plays his character as snarky, vengeful, and yet strangely regretful of his past life from time to time, and watching the transition between these extremes is every bit as enticing as it is impressive. Now for the downside to Dom Hemingway. It's short. Not so much needs 10 to 20 minutes short, but feels like the audience watched half a movie short. Everything happens so quickly in Dom Hemingway that by the time it concludes, it feels as if it's just getting started. It may not have needed to be a 3-hour epic, but so much more depth than this would have easily made it one of the best in 2014. Instead, it's only pretty good in contrast to being great, and I give it a B+.
All right. Joe, what did you think of Dom Hemingway?
Well, I'm glad I got to see it. I think that Dom Hemingway is actually like kind of one of these perfect examples of what Justin said. People now are really trying to toe the line here with this protagonist who's traditionally an antagonist, and pushing the boundaries of what we can accept. And I think Dom Hemingway is a character that just kind of absorbs the whole film. He carries it himself. And that is because of Jude Law's fantastic performance. This is quite possibly one of his best, if not his best performances. I loved him in this. He got completely absorbed into this character, and you just loved it. How over the top he was, how kind of sophisticated he was, even though he is kind of this brutish thug. He just is like a character that I can really get behind. And, it's just, there's something so likable about him. He's just this very interesting guy, despite the terrible things he can do. And even by the end of the movie, you're like, okay, maybe there's hope for him, but he's still kind of a bad guy. And I kind of like that. And I think that having such a well-written character is the main strength of this movie. This character is incredibly strong, and the dialogue in this movie is just so witty. It's just something that everything rolls off your tongue so quickly, kind of like the actual motions of the film itself in terms of its plot. It's very integrated with the style of how they threw the narrative through. I also really liked the soundtrack. I thought the soundtrack was really, really good at accentuating the atmosphere. I thought it kind of balanced the chaotic nature of the film. The plot itself, I do agree, was a bit short, and I kind of wish that they had expanded on some more things, but I felt that the arc was complete. I thought that it was kind of actually better where it was centered in. I really enjoyed it a lot, and I would give it an A-.
Very good. Well, as we've discussed many times on this show, and off the air as well, this has easily been the worst year for movies since I started trying to watch just about every major release about 7 years ago. Dom Hemingway is a bright diamond in a pile of garbage. Law brings an extraordinary and hilarious life to the title character. He's a pile of flaws, but I don't think he's actually a bad person, though he does act like it sometimes. His exploits are completely episodic in nature, even down to Frasier-esque title cards every 10 to 15 minutes, but they all tie together somehow also. This is the kind of quirkiness I wish Wes Anderson would bring to his movies, a little bit more subtle. Dom's definitely quirky as anything, but it never tries too hard. It's just the right amount. The supporting characters are great as well, especially Richard E. Grant as Dom's put-upon best friend Dickie. Mm-hmm. And I will echo Joe's sentiments that the soundtrack is fantastic, and it supports the scenes very well. My one complaint would be that sometimes the dialogue tries slightly too hard to emulate a Simon Pegg Nick Frost repartee between the two leads, but Jude Law gives the best performance I've seen so far this year, and though usually the Oscars don't take notice to roles like these, hopefully the Golden Globes will honor Law next year. Dom Hemingway is the first 2014 release that I give an A. Loved it. I'm really glad you got to see it, Joe.
I loved it.
Yeah.
I hope it would get a sequel or something. Or
yeah,
a prequel. What a character.
I would love it. Yeah. I sort of agree with both of you on the length. I mean, yeah, it was short, but only because it was such a fun ride, it went by in a flash.
So fast, yeah.
You know? But I do think that the story kind of resolved itself, and it left it open-ended a little bit, but
like
just enough that you're like, okay.
I think his arc was complete,
yeah.
But that character lends himself so well to being in other stories.
I agree.
Even if he was a supporting character,
I agree.
We would see him. He's just so enjoyable.
And we did on the show just a few weeks ago the movies we would like to see as TV shows. This could easily be, another Showtime, like just a Shameless or something like that. The character is fantastic.
You could tell that's what it's modeled after, like kind of a Tony Soprano, Don Draper, Walter White. Like kind of like you could see him balancing that family, but also trying to do the hijinks as well with his criminal life.
Right.
It's something that would work perfectly for TV now, like on HBO or something.
I completely agree. Unfortunately, this one got a relatively short theatrical release, so if you don't get to see it in theaters, hopefully you can catch it very soon on DVD or video on demand. It's definitely one to watch.
Oh, I loved it.
All right, well, now, speaking of home video, we've got the home media moment, and this week that is Odd Thomas, and Joe's going to tell us about that.
Let's talk about Odd Thomas. It's a mystery thriller based on the novel of the same name by Dean Koontz. It was written and directed by Stephen Sommers and stars Anton Yelchin as Odd Thomas and Willem Dafoe as Police Chief Wyatt Porter. Odd Thomas is a young man who has inherited psychic abilities, including speaking with the dead and seeing hazy visions of the future. He uses these abilities to try and avenge murders or stop them before they happen. After being visited by a vision of many faceless phantoms, Thomas begins a new investigation to prevent a possible mass murder from a vicious evil within his town. Yelchin does a great job with the lead role and seems to fit well into the awkward but charming monologues. I also found some of the editing techniques to be somewhat interesting, using varieties of fading to create ghostly creatures called bodaks. These guys help the atmosphere, which fits the supernatural theme. A great deal happens in Odd Thomas, so it feels like there really is a lot to take in. While I do like the general plot, I feel that the tone might be difficult to grasp onto. Since the tone is kind of over the top and silly, it doesn't quite gel with the dark nature of the plot. It also doesn't help that I don't really like Dean Koontz too much as an author. Though I liked Anton Yelchin a great deal, and as I've seen him in previous movies such as, I believe, Hearts in Atlantis, as well as the new Star Trek reboots, I thought that he was the strongest element of the film. I don't feel that the mystery was that intriguing as it could potentially have been, and I leave Odd Thomas with a C.
Yeah, this is something of a cross between Buffy the Vampire Slayer and several recent young adult adaptations. The movie has the unfortunate problem of being a semi-interesting character in a completely been-there, done-that situation. Yelchin is pretty fun as Odd, but the film tries way too hard to be funny and hip, and it gets old quickly. The special effects are well done, and the plot is watchable, but unfortunately it just ends up being average, and I also give it a C. Justin?
As I've mentioned on the show before, a great adaptation decides what will translate well to screen and what will not. This is especially challenging for the work of author Dean Koontz, where that's always in question in adapting his work, notably in the Odd Thomas series. However, much like its source material, the film has the promise of something better, but just isn't. Although I did really enjoy Anton Yelchin, and I think he's perfect to play Odd, the tone of the film is, well, odd. Half of the film, as you both have mentioned, feels...
Had to do it.
Half of the film feels like a quirky supernatural horror comedy, and the other a dark mystery thriller. And neither really ends up achieving what they set out to do. It's not really unwatchable so much as it is awkward when these tones shift throughout the film. That said, the final twist does strike an emotional chord, and a few editing tricks keep the film lively. No pun intended. It doesn't quite save it, but it does make one wonder what an Odd Thomas franchise would be like, even though that's very unlikely to happen, and I give it a C-.
Yeah, I thought Yelchin did a good job.
I thought he was great.
Yeah, he was not at all a part of my complaint. I think we're all in agreement on that. He was probably one of the best parts of it.
I've always liked him. I've always thought he's had talent. He's getting more limelight lately, but he was in Harsh and Atlantis. I really liked him in, and also I believe it was Long Came a Spider.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he was like,
never saw it.
These were when he was like a kid in very minor roles. Like he was one of those popular child actors in like the late 90s, early 2000s. Disappeared, and then he's come back recently with Star Trek. So
well, and the movie Charlie Bartlett, which was not a good movie, but he was really good in it.
He's he's good.
He's likable.
I like him.
That's the best way to put it.
You like watching him.
Yeah. All right. Well, in honor of Godzilla, this week's top 5 is the top 5 rebooted film franchises. Joe, why don't we start with you on this one?
All right, I'm going to do 5 through 2, right?
Yes, 5 through 2.
All right, well, first we're going to start off with the obvious, Star Trek. I mean, it really, in terms of the film franchise and just the franchise in general, Star Trek was kind of losing some of its popularity. It was losing some of its gusto. And this one kind of breathed new life into it. It was kind of a cool comeback. A lot of old references to old films, old episodes that fans would get, but also making it a little more accessible to a wider audience. It's not my favorite direction, but I can't argue that it's had some success. Number 4 is Dredd. I like the original Judge Dredd, but I like it because it's kind of ridiculous and kind of bad. You know, I like it ironically. I mean, Sylvester Stallone is funny, but Dredd is an honest retelling of the comic. I think it's much true to the character. Carl Urban, just owns this role. And I mean, if the franchise does go anywhere, I mean, it had a great place to start. Number 3 will probably make you guys happy. It's Rise of the Planet of the Apes. I mean, I think, interestingly enough, this franchise was kind of rebooted twice, but there was the Tim Burton attempt, which
we don't talk about.
Didn't go anywhere. And this
was sort of like Godzilla in a way. They attempted to reboot that 15 years ago.
That's a good way to. That's a good comparison. It didn't quite take because of how poorly it was done.
Right.
This one, I think, actually, once again, takes the true elements of the original series, but takes it into a much newer, expanded direction, making it a little more updated, but it's quite wonderful. Number 2 is Captain America. Now, I know you don't like the movie very much, Dan, but have you seen any of the other Captain America movies from the 70s or 90s?
I did see the 1990 film, yes.
And I think you could agree.
The worst thing ever.
I think if you're going to reboot a character, it was something that really needed to happen, and I think that with future films, he's become a big part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Captain America is one of those characters that everybody knew needed a reboot badly. He finally got one, and he's taking to higher levels of quality. I mean, really.
I don't mind that that's on there. Because, as I've mentioned on the show, I didn't like the first movie, but I do really like the character.
And I'm saying that...
So, I'm okay with that.
I think as a catalyst, I mean, it just breathes so much new life into the character on screen, and it's something that I know that, like, hardcore fans of Captain America were waiting for a long time patiently.
Right.
And they finally got it. It was kind of like always one of those black stains in Marvel's history, like those Captain America movies. And not just the 90 one, the ones previous, the 70s movies... Red Brown.
That's what I've heard.
I won't even talk about it. They're pretty bad.
Great list as always,
Thanks.
Joe. Good start. All right, well, I'm actually going to start mine with a honorable mention.
Okay.
And that is The Three Stooges.
Is that a...
That's why it's honorable mention.
Okay.
It only sort of half counts, but obviously it was a bunch of shorts back in the day, and, they rebooted it as a full-length movie.
So you liked that?
I really did, actually.
Because a lot of people didn't.
Yes.
Me.
I think most
I heard mixed things.
Fans of the Stooges liked it, though, because it was being reverential to the original series. The guys portraying Larry, Moe, and Curly did really, really good jobs. And they were sort of doing, like, impressions, but also with their own sort of personality on it.
Okay.
So for me, I liked it. I'm a big fan of the Farrelly brothers anyway.
Okay.
So That gets honorable mention. My number 5 is X-Men First Class. I'm not as much, I think, of an X-Men fan as you guys are, but this was for me the best in the series. I really like the way that they brought everything back to the past, mixed it a little bit with some other things. You had that Wolverine cameo.
That's sort of like a half reboot, I guess.
It is.
But I see where you're coming from. That was a good way to breathe new life into it. For sure.
Yeah. And I sort of think of a reboot as something with kind of an all-new cast. Which this, like I would include a lot of the Bond movies in that category as well, the reboots. Mm-hmm. But obviously, X-Men Days of Future Past will have both the new and the old cast in it coming out next week.
It still works.
But yeah.
Still works.
My number 4 is The Muppets. I'm sure you guys figured this would be on my list somewhere. I don't need to talk about it. I talk about it about every other week. Number 3 is Sherlock Holmes.
Ooh.
There are really seemingly 2 roles that Robert Downey Jr. was absolutely born to play. Iron Man, of course, is one, and the detective Sherlock Holmes is the other. He embodies this character, I think, just as much as he does Tony Stark. And again, another great Jude Law performance as Watson. And I think you've got a good franchise there. Unfortunately, the second movie was not as good.
I still liked it.
It was okay. The first one was great, though.
Moriarty, though.
Yeah, Moriarty was fine. We know.
It carried the movie.
But hopefully the third one will sort of course correct that a little bit.
Yes.
And my number 2 is Batman Begins.
I'm Batman.
One of, I think, the great superhero franchises ever, the new Batman series. As Joe very well knows, I have limited knowledge of the original Batman series. I've seen Batman Forever. I've seen parts of the Michael Keaton Batman.
Yeah, we need to correct
that. Classic Penguin, Danny DeVito. For one thing.
Well, we'll get there.
But the Nolan trilogy is, I don't think anyone can deny how powerful it is. And Batman Begins really is sort of an unsung hero of that. A lot of people focus on The Dark Knight, which is my favorite of the trilogy, but Batman Begins is also an excellent film.
Actually, I think that you're right. Batman Begins does not get enough credit. And actually, to this day, it's still my favorite of the trilogy.
Personally. I know a lot of people whose it's favorites, actually.
I think it's actually very good. I will spoil it right now. I don't have any of those movies on my list because I do have very mixed feelings about the interpretation of the character.
Sure.
But I can't deny, considering where we left off with
Mr.
Freeze and Hell Batman, it was something that needed to happen, and it did something really good to bring Batman to kind of serious ground again. So yeah,
right.
that is a good choice.
Thank you.
For sure.
All right, Justin, let's hear the start of your list.
Number 5, Star Trek. It took the story in a more universally accessible direction, though one could argue it also divided diehard fans. It had very entertaining new additions and fantastic visuals, and while the sequel didn't quite blow me away, I still think there is a lot of potential for this as a franchise. Okay, number 4, Godzilla. I covered a lot of this in my review, but I feel like this was a great installment for a series that has a lot of promise. I thought the director really showed that he can handle both making an independent monster movie and a big blockbuster monster movie really, really well, and making them both translate fairly efficiently. Number 3, Dan, I think you'll appreciate this. X-Men First Class.
Nice.
I think Joe said it best on this one. It really did give life to what was really beginning to look like a dying franchise. X-Men 3 really, really made a lot of people mad, myself included. X-Men Origins Wolverine was really bad.
Poop.
So the fact that this really came out and showed that X-Men movies can still be good is really something special.
I'm with you there.
And I feel like it really complemented the original series, yet does its own thing at the same time. And I really can't wait to see how this is going to be handled after X-Men Days of Future Past.
Days of Future Past, I think, is going to probably be the most successful of the X-Men movies. The hype around it cannot be denied.
Well,
so if it delivers, I think it's going to have legs, and it could be one of the biggest hits of the summer.
Absolutely.
I'm hoping.
It's funny, actually, Justin, you mentioned that. It's true. When I went in to see First Class, I wasn't really expecting much. And I remember I actually had to sell this to people. Some people, my friends, wouldn't see this because the last couple X-Men movies were so bad. I was like, trust me, Like, they're like, an X-Men movie is good again? What? Like, no. No, really, I had to convince people.
No, I mean, I threw in the towel after Origins Wolverine. I actually had to have two people, Dan, I think you were actually one of them at the time, to actually convince me to,
I love
to
First
sit down
Class.
and watch this.
Yeah.
I was so glad.
It's very good.
But getting to my number 2, Batman Begins. Dan, I feel like you definitely hit this one that Head and Joe, I believe your comments speak for themselves as well. Really just reinvented a superhero franchise that Joel Schumacher, there's no better way to put it, he bastardized it.
No, you're right. He destroyed it.
No one told a darker story, but I feel like it just worked in such a really gritty, really epic way. While the conclusion to the trilogy had its issues with many people, myself included, it still showed that it was one of the more promising reboots of the last few years.
Good choice. Joe, what is your number 1 reboot?
My number 1 is Casino Royale.
Nice.
Yeah, I really cannot express how... Like, I'm a pretty big James Bond fan. I've seen, I think, pretty much all the movies. I really have loved it. I kind of grew up with it. It's big in my family. And Pierce Brosnan's era started off good and kind of went down a bit. And I didn't take it that seriously. And I kind of forgot about James Bond for a while. And then I went back, saw Casino Royale, and I thought... This is one of the best action movies I've ever seen. It's one of the best spy movies I've ever seen. I love Daniel Craig as kind of this gritty Bond who's apparently closer to the actual Ian Fleming novels, from what I understand. And I never actually saw the original Casino Royale in its entirety, but I can safely say that this one entertained me a lot more, hooked me, and I think this was a great new direction for the more modern Bond. I think Daniel Craig has really, really just shown how much he can captivate audiences as this character. Very different direction, I think different than any of the others, but so strong. Such a good film. Great start to a new franchise. And
Nice.
It's led to mixed results, but I think it's great.
Cool. Yeah, I will point out, I really considered putting that on my top 5, but that was actually the first Bond movie I ever saw. So it's hard for me to say, to be able to compare it properly with the others like you guys can.
I'm glad that you were honest about it, but it still would have been correct.
Well, yes, I'm sure it would have. I have no doubt. But instead, my number 1 is Star Trek.
Oh, wow.
Now, I am what you might call a fringe Star Trek fan. I grew up around it. My dad's a huge fan. I've seen probably a small handful of episodes of the original series, maybe a dozen to 15 or so of the Next Generation, and a few of the movies along the way. So, I know the characters, I know how it's supposed to go, but I'm not like a Trekkie, an uber fan.
Mm-hmm.
I think am the target audience for what that film was. I think Star Trek was, and you both mentioned it, when you had it in your top 5, that it breathed this new life into a series, and it was unhip and uncool when J.J. Abrams decided to retool it and redo it with the original characters with a new cast, which I think was, the cast they picked couldn't have been better. We've talked about that a couple times on the show. So that is my number 1. I thought it was a great, great film, and I am a fan of Into Darkness as well. I know Justin didn't care for it as much as I did, but hopefully
I thought
future installments will be just as good.
I liked it a lot, so.
Yeah. Justin?
Much like Joe, my number 1 is also Casino Royale.
Yeah.
It is quite possibly the textbook example of a reboot done right. Daniel Craig as Bond offers an inner darkness and flaws that audiences have never seen to the character before. And while the follow-up, Quantum of Solace, was rather unimpressive, if not mediocre, Skyfall and Casino Royale have been on my top 5 ever since I've seen them for Bond movies. And much like Days of Future Past, I can't wait to see where it's going next.
Good list all around. All right, so now we're going to move into our triple feature of older films, and that's going to start out with new classic Savages. Justin's going to tell us about that.
Ben, played by Aaron Taylor Johnson, and Sean, played by Taylor Kitsch, have produced and sold weed that surpasses anything else out there for years, while being equally in love with their girlfriend Ophelia, otherwise known as O, played by Blake Lively. However, when they refuse a partnership with a Mexican drug cartel led by Elena, played by Salma Hayek, they kidnap O, and Ben and Sean begin to wage war to get her back. As with most of the films of director Oliver Stone, there seems to be some form of hidden subtext, but unfortunately gets lost in the treatment of the overall narrative from the perspective of the weakest character in the over 2-hour rampage. O, who never really exceeds being much more than an annoying ditzy damsel for the better portion of the film. Granted, her character was never meant to be intelligent, but her dialogue is so hammy and reliant on voiceover that it pulls the audience out of the story almost every time. However, what does work well comes from the overall story itself, as well as the performances from the rest of the cast, notably from Hayek as quite possibly one of the more memorable female villains of recent years. The action is gritty and intense, and while the editing goes in every which way imaginable, it does help keep the story interesting even when it occasionally comes off as melodramatic. Sadly, the ending seems like a bit of a cop-out, but overall, Savages is a good revenge thriller with just a few things holding it back, and I give it a B.
Well, for me, this was only the second Oliver Stone movie I've ever seen. He always seemed a little bit too gratuitously violent for me, and if Savages is any sort of indication, I'm not too far off. Some scenes are definitely too far off the rails, and I have to look away for a few seconds, but even those scenes are done very well. Maybe a little gratuitous, but it seems realistic in the context of these characters. Stone's directing is pretty focused and artistic in a gritty way, and performances from Hayek and Kitsch specifically keep the story moving. The problem with Savages, other than, like Justin noted, Blake Lively's voiceovers, is that there's not a likable character in the bunch. You don't root for anybody really at any point in the whole movie. Though you might feel bad for Lively or even John Travolta at some points, who plays a DEA agent, nobody is really a decent person, so it gives little investment for any of the characters. That and, as Justin also mentioned, a completely half-baked ending. I give Savages a B as well. Joe?
When it comes to Savages, I normally like Oliver Stone. I actually do think that his direction is pretty well focused, and he does manage to get decent performances from his actors. Generally, I think he's pretty good at that. I think Stone is good in that sense. This particular story, I think in regards to the editing, I did like the gritty style of it, but I felt that it was kind of all over the place. I thought that it was also overly long. I did not like the cop-out ending.
Yeah.
It annoyed me. I did like the violence, though. I thought it fit well. It was a bit gratuitous, but at points perhaps, but I thought it fit well.
I did too.
I thought they did well with the makeup design, the effects work. I did like that they tried to make it very realistic and gritty, and it was kind of showing a darker side of the basic drug trade. I mean, even though it's marijuana, shows that there's a lot of death and destruction that goes into that.
Yeah.
But the big problem I had with Savages was that I hated all the characters.
Thank you. Right?
The main character, made me want to stop watching the movie about 5 minutes in. I honestly didn't. I was not looking forward to it. Thankfully, it doesn't focus on her that much.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily call her the main character. I think she's the main focal point.
She's the main focal point.
But
the thing is that she has these terrible monologues, and whoever wrote her dialogue is terrible. It's cringe-inducing. And I don't really like her. I'm not really behind any of the other characters. I thought Salma Hayek was interesting, but they didn't do enough with her. Honestly, like they had potential for her storyline, her character development. I did like her. I thought she was a decent performer, but she was underutilized.
Right.
I thought that some of the other henchmen were just stereotypes. I thought John Travolta was actually all right. He's the closest thing to, I think, a likable character. I think he is too. And I was like, well, he's barely in it. So I just felt, I'm sorry, guys. I couldn't really get behind a movie where I didn't like really any of the characters, and the story was kind of all over the place. It was overly long, and I give it a C+.
Okay. I'm okay with that.
I didn't. Besides the stylistic nature of it, the direction, and some of the acting, I thought that it was not that good.
Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, the criteria for a new classic, we haven't talked about this in a little while, is that Justin and I have had to give this movie a B- or higher. And sometimes Joe has seen them ahead of time. This one he had not. But I think even for Justin and I, it's a pretty fringe new classic. I mean, we're definitely not cheerleaders for it.
I'll be honest, your reviews weren't very glowing, so I'm surprised you gave it Bs. I thought maybe
I thought it was engaging. And I thought the acting was pretty good from certainly Salma Hayek. I thought the directing was pretty good.
I just didn't like the story, I guess.
Okay.
The story and the characters.
Yeah, that's totally fair.
I think that was what was weak for me. I just didn't like it. I didn't feel invested.
Yeah, it's funny that Salma Hayek really is sort of the quote-unquote villain, but she's kind of like the most likable of the bunch of hooligans.
Quite possibly the
Probably.
most rational.
Like, if you take away John Travolta, because he's not really part of their
The main
collective,
story, yeah.
she's sort of, she's the most put together. She's the most rational.
Very nice drug dealer.
She is kind of a nice drug dealer,
When she's
actually.
not cutting your hand off.
She'll
give you like a nice armchair and some munchies.
That's true.
Cable TV.
That's true. No, Joe, I'm completely fine with a C+. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, it falls in that category of like it's a movie that I can see people liking, but I'm not going to hold them back if they find the flaws more glaring than the other things that make up for it for me personally. But
Yeah, that's fine. I mean,
the opening scene of the whole movie is that Blake Lively narration where she says,
Look.
just because I'm telling this story doesn't mean I'm alive at the end.
which is so like
Which is A, stupid,
and cliche.
and B, I know Joe, by about 10 minutes in, didn't care if she was dead or alive.
No, I like I said, I don't know if there was a way they could have reorganized the story around that, because
I think just giving her better dialogue would have helped.
That would have helped. Yeah, like, I can't say that her performance is bad, but like, if that's the way this character's speaking, I just thought it was terrible.
Yeah.
I couldn't deal with it.
I just didn't feel like she should have been the narrator.
Why was she the narrator?
Yeah, I mean, this could have easily been handled from like a third-person perspective.
Or, from another character's outside.
Or from Aaron Taylor Johnson's perspective.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the time we see his character sort of go from this like peace-loving pacifist to this
He's
cold-blooded
probably
killer.
the one. Yeah, he's probably the one you might feel the most bad for, just because not feel the most bad for, but identify with, because he is a bad guy, but at least he has this inner struggle because he's sort of a hippie and he doesn't want to hurt people. I don't know. It would have maybe given it an interesting perspective.
And he didn't want to be a bad... He was complicated, I guess, but
Yeah.
I thought he was a weak character because he was kind of pushed around by the other guy, personally.
Okay.
That bothered me. I thought he was a hypocrite. I just didn't like his characters. I'm sorry, I didn't like them.
I don't see a lot of these kind of like drug cartel type movies, so maybe
I've
for
seen
me,
quite a few.
Yeah, you've seen a ton, so you probably can gauge better what's good and what's not so hot.
I think so.
Okay,
But
and that's fair.
I don't know.
All right, well now it is time for Old Classic, and this week was my pick, and I wanted to honor the late Bob Hoskins. And originally I was going to run the movie Mermaids, which if you have not seen that, I would recommend it. It's with Cher and Winona Ryder, and he plays a supporting role in that. However, I only have that on VHS, and it's a very, very worn tape. So instead, we watched Who Framed Roger Rabbit. It's 1947, and cartoon characters are basically living creatures that star in their cartoons, just like live actors do. Toons live in Toontown in California and interact with humans there and in other places. The late Hoskins stars as human detective Eddie Valiant, who is hired by the owner of Maroon Cartoon Studios, played by Alan Tilvern, to prove the rumor that the wife of his biggest star, Roger Rabbit, voiced by Charlie Fleischer, is cheating on him. The man she's supposedly cheating with, Marvin Acme, the owner of Toontown and, of course, the Acme Corp., played by Stubby K, is murdered the next day, making Roger the #1 suspect of Judge Doom, Christopher Lloyd. Kathleen Turner voices Jessica Rabbit, Roger's girl, in an uncredited role. In a top 5 we did on this show last year, this film was discussed as one of the greatest murder mysteries of all time. And it definitely is that, but it's so much more. In an absolutely groundbreaking move, some of the biggest animation studios in the world, including Disney and Warner Brothers, lent their biggest cartoon stars for cameo roles, and it provides the film with a world that makes Toontown as believable as it can possibly be. If Toontown did exist, why wouldn't Bugs, Mickey, Donald, Daffy, Droopy, and Dumbo all live together? The special effects and art direction still hold up flawlessly today, and in addition to the 6 Oscar nominations the film received, including 4 that it won, Richard Williams won a Special Achievement Award for animation direction. Who Framed Roger Rabbit is a great nod to film noir, has a fantastic story, is funny, clever, inventive, and is as magical today as it was when my father took me to see it when I was 10. It is an absolute A+. Joe?
Couldn't really say it any better.
Thank you.
I'm trying to actually think of something I can add to that. Well, I think Bob Hoskins does a great job. I think
He does.
It's probably, I'd say for most people, it's probably his best movie. I think this is an iconic Christopher Lloyd role. I mean, it's one of those ones.
It really is.
Like, people, I don't think you might think about it immediately, but I know that there's, obviously Doc Brown's a big one, but this is another one up for him that is, like, just so well known. I think he does a great job and has a very unique like kind of frightening but also ridiculous villain. It fits very well with the tone of the film. I like the fact that it is kind of a nod to film noir, but it's still kind of cartoony. It's still fun. It has this great balance, and I think just everything that goes into this movie that really makes it stand out for me is not necessarily just the animation and the direction. Just it looks beautiful. It looks amazing. It's just so well done. But it's not just that. It's the fact that it actually happened. Because the fact that these companies were able to put their differences aside to put something this awesome together and do it so well, so cohesively, really gives me hope for filmmaking and storytelling in general. Because these people putting their differences aside just to please people and create such a classic film, I think is great. I mean, that's really, I think, one of the great testaments about Who Framed Roger Rabbit is really that. Because it's one of the few times I can think of where something of that magnitude happened between like several major organizations to bring something that creatively awesome together. So I will.
We touched on it briefly when we did Wreck-It Ralph for New Classic too, because sort of in the video game world, same type of thing.
Probably not.
Although they had smaller it was one scene with all of them.
It's not quite as heavy of a rivalry,
right.
But that's still, I think, a lesser example of that kind of teamwork that I like to see. There really isn't much I have to add. I think it's just a fantastic testament to animation and just filmmaking in general. It's a great movie, and I would give it an A+.
Nice. Justin?
Great stories often come from the unlikeliest of places, notably within genres. Cartoons and noir would never be expected to gel together, but here it's natural, original, and most importantly, very funny. Seeing and spotting the endless array of cartoon cameos is always fun and very entertaining. However, this gets paired with strong writing and great acting, particularly from the late Bob Hoskins as Detective Eddie Valiant, who wants nothing more to do with tunes, and Kathleen Turner voicing the iconic femme fatale, Jessica Rabbit. It's never too dark nor too silly, even during the third act where everything gets, no pun intended, much more animated. And ultimately complements the uniqueness of the film as a whole. Who Framed Roger Rabbit is an absolute timeless family film that still very much holds up today, and I also happily give it an A+.
One of the rare all A+ movies that we've had on this show.
It's hard to really argue it.
What can you say that's wrong with it? You know?
I mean,
just even the little like idiosyncrasies, like having Hoskins' brother, having Valiant's brother, having been killed by a tune, years before.
Works
it's like
for the story.
It's so brilliant that they put that in the script. It works great for the story.
It's perfectly fine.
I never would have thought of that.
I mean, the only thing I could think of that was a criticism when I was watching it, because it's been a long time since I've seen it, was that it was a little too silly. But then I thought about it. What is this movie? It's kind of silly. It's the point.
Yeah.
It speaks to cartoons and classic, and I think also watching a lot of the cartoons before the shows, like we've been doing, is really kind of get me into that mode of like what the classic cartoons are about. They're funny, they're silly, they cater to children, but they also can be witty and smart as well.
Yeah, Before we watch our new classic or our old classic every Tuesday, we draw an old cartoon out of a hat and watch it, and Bugs, Daffy, Sylvester.
I'm actually kind
Popeye.
of thankful for that, because just something I never do. I don't really watch classic cartoons that much. I did when I was a kid, but those old school cartoons I don't watch as much. So I think it's definitely a good way to give me a new angle of appreciation for it.
Well, and it's sad. I don't think a lot of kids watch them because they're not really on anymore. Like when we were growing up, certainly when I was growing up in the 80s, I mean, that was Saturday morning cartoons. Half of it was old, repackaged Bugs episodes, and Tom and Jerry aired every day. And
I know that they syndicated a lot of them when we were kids, Justin.
When you guys, well, when you guys were young, they were on Cartoon Network,
stuff like that. Yeah.
But now it's like everything's sort of on demand, and it's all the new Nick cartoons and the Disney cartoons.
They push the new stuff,
and I don't think kids really know who
have that much exposure.
Some of these characters even are, other than maybe Tom and Jerry. Obviously, Scooby-Doo still runs a lot.
You should.
Probably Bugs. But,
You're right.
Porky Pig, probably not.
Not as big.
Roadrunner, maybe not.
Yeah.
It's kind of sad.
That's true.
All right, well, finally on the show we have our Oscar A to Z, and this week that's All the President's Men. And this is a 1976 film that garnered 8 nominations. It won Art Direction, Adapted Screenplay, and Best Supporting Actor for Jason Robards, and it was nominated for Director, Picture, and Supporting Actress, among others. Joe's going to tell us about All the President's Men.
It's a 1976 political thriller based on actual events involving two reporters who investigated the Watergate scandal. You know, that thing with Nixon? I'm not a crook. You know, that whole thing. It was directed by Alan Pakula and stars Robert Redford, of course, awesome, and my personal favorite, Dustin Hoffman, as Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. This film is an adaptation of the memoirs of the two reporters, and it really shows. The film is poignant, and while it does have its fair share of drama, the two reporters don't start out as the best of friends, but work well together. This is brought out well, though, through great acting from both the leads, as I would expect, fairly early in their careers. President's Men works as a rather honest and compelling look at a huge scandal which had only occurred a couple years earlier. This film no doubt increased the widespread nature of the mysterious Deep Throat character, and classic sayings like, follow the money. A tight script and excellent directing make this one lengthy, but an enjoyable tale. And I give it an A.
Nice. Yeah, political dramas are very hard to do. If you go too political, you bore the audience that isn't really all that interested in politics and just wants to see the drama. And that's why All the President's Men works so well. It focuses almost entirely on the efforts of Woodward and Bernstein as newspaper reporters to get the story, which just happens to be about corruption in the White House. The story they're trying to get could honestly have been about anything that people don't want to name names for. The mob, big business, anything. Which is why this is maybe the least political drama I think I've seen. And it works so well. Hoffman and Redford are fantastic in their roles, and it's a sharp Oscar-winning script from William Goldman. It runs on a little long, as Joe said, gets a little bit repetitive with all the interviews with the people, but it is definitely a great addition to the genre, and I give it an A-. Justin?
The story behind Woodward and Bernstein's cracking of the Watergate scandal comes off often like a mystery thriller, so it's no surprise that it has lent itself beautifully to film. This is largely due to director Pakula's talent behind the camera for some truly gorgeous cinematography, as well as the outstanding chemistry between Hoffman and Redford. From them, the audience can clearly see the contrasting methods of investigative journalism, and yet how both were necessary in the overall breaking of the notorious scandal without undermining either one in the overall process. However, where the film truly shines is the fact that within the 2 hours and 18-minute running time, it's never boring and has several moments in which the film seems to take profiles of the individuals they interviewed along the way. While many of them are not entirely necessary, it does help show the struggles along the way to getting the overall evidence. All the President's Men is a very well-constructed film, more than deserving of its win for Best Picture, among many others, and I give it an A+.
Ooh, wow, very nice, Justin. I'm really excited to see some of these other Redford roles as we go through the Oscar AZ, because back in the day, just about everything he was in was nominated for something. So this was one I had not seen before, and I'm glad we got to watch it. All right, well, that is going to do it for the show this week. As we mentioned earlier, you guys just put up the latest There Goes Tokyo for Godzilla. So that is you can link to that in the description portion of this video. And don't forget, we also have the hyperlink. So where you see those timestamps next to the movies, you could just click on that and jump right to that movie, whatever you want to hear. Joe, anything new with you on the Merlin page?
Oh, yeah, we did do a little in-car review of Godzilla.
Nice.
So we discussed that. That was one. And, yeah, I'm actually planning on putting up a couple other videos as well.
Very good. And you can, of course, link to that as well. We've got the Facebook, and you can see our 5-word reviews there weekly, just a day or two before we put up that week's episode. And that is Film Fanatics with an exclamation point. And our Twitter feed is @FilmFanaticsPod. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week. Hail Hydra!